They say losing your home feels like losing a part of yourself. But what if one morning you pulled up to that place you'd called home for years and found someone tearing it apart as if you never existed? I'll never forget that Tuesday. The sun was barely cutting through the mist over the lake. I had a paper cup of coffee balanced on the console, boots still dusty from yesterday's yard work, humming an old song my grandpa used to sing on fishing trips. The gravel crunched under my tires as I turned down the familiar dirt road, but instead of the quiet cabin tucked beneath the trees, I was met with chaos. Cement trucks, roaring backup alarms, men in neon vests shouting over the growl of machines. The spot where my family's cabin had stood for nearly half a century. Nothing left but broken boards and a foundation already being swallowed by steel rods and fresh concrete. I froze, my coffee sloshed onto the seat, but I couldn't even blink. 8 years of my life here. My father's proposal to my mother right by the dock. My grandfather's ashes scattered from that old fishing chair still rusting by the shoreline. Gone. All of it buried under someone else's dream. I stood there in the dust, and for a second I swear it felt like watching a church burn while the arsonist smiled and called it progress. That's when she arrived. Victoria Sterling, HOA president, and if you've ever met someone who can smile without actually smiling, you'd understand the chill I felt. She stepped out of her spotless BMW, heels clicking on the gravel like she owned every inch of it. Designer sunglasses, hair so perfectly arranged it didn't dare move with the wind. She looked at me the way a realtor looks at an empty lot. "Oh, Jake," she said, with that syrupy voice people use when they're not actually sorry. "I'm so sorry you had to see this. Emergency demolition, safety hazards, expired covenants, you understand." She even waved a permit in front of me, paper flapping in the breeze like it was supposed to make this nightmare legal. I should have screamed, called the sheriff, thrown myself on the rubble and refused to move. That's what everyone expected. Instead, I did the last thing Victoria was prepared for. I thanked her. "Thank you for improving the neighborhood, Victoria," I said calmly, dust settling on my boots. "This'll raise property values for everyone." The smile cracked for just a second, a tiny flicker of confusion, then gone. I leaned into it, started asking about her timeline, the features of the villa, whether she planned on putting in a dock. The construction foreman glanced at me like I'd lost my mind. Victoria tried to keep her poise, but my calm interest was throwing her script into pieces. And then my brother Danny showed up. He's the type who'd wrestle a bear if it meant protecting family. He jumped out of his truck, tool belt jangling, red in the face the moment he saw the wreckage. "Have you lost your damn mind?" he shouted at me, pointing to the rubble. "Grandpa's chair was right there, Dad proposed to Mom right there, and you're asking about her infinity pool." Neighbors began gathering on sidewalks, whispering behind hands. Some looked curious, some looked pitying. A few shook their heads like I'd finally cracked. And maybe they were right. Maybe I looked like a man watching his whole legacy stolen while he nodded politely. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that I had already started the clock on something much bigger. Victoria looked at me with that thin, practiced smile. My brother was practically vibrating with fury. Neighbors whispered like they were watching a public breakdown. And I pulled out my phone, stepped away just enough so everyone could see me talking but not hear the words, and said only this. "It's starting exactly as planned. 8 weeks from today, everything changes." I ended the call and slid the phone back into my pocket. When I turned around, Victoria's smile had slipped again, just for a heartbeat, a look that said she wasn't sure anymore who was in control. And that was the first moment I knew she'd built her plan too fast, too loud, too proud. And she'd walked right into mine. 3 nights after the demolition, while most of the neighborhood slept, I was hunched over boxes in my grandfather's old house with nothing but a flickering flashlight and the sound of the wind rattling the gutters. It was 2 in the morning. The floorboards creaked with every step, and dust rose in little clouds with each box I dragged from the corner. To anyone peeking through the window, I probably looked insane. A grown man digging through decades of yellowed receipts and warranty cards like he was preparing for tax season in the middle of the night. But my grandfather, he wasn't just a man. He was a fortress. paranoid, meticulous, prepared for enemies nobody else thought existed. While the rest of the family rolled their eyes at his filing cabinet stacked with useless paperwork, I remembered every time he'd chuckle and say, "One day, Jake, you'll thank me for this mess." And that night, with my flashlight beam trembling across dusty folders, I finally understood what he meant. He kept everything: receipts for coffee bought in 1973, warranty slips for appliances that hadn't worked since before I was born, insurance policies layered so thick they could have papered the walls. Most of it seemed meaningless until I noticed the pattern. The folders weren't random, they were cross-referenced, color-coded, legal terms scribbled in his shaky handwriting. Grandpa hadn't been hoarding, he'd been building a system. And buried deep behind files labeled property protection and legal insurance, I found it. The Holy Grail. A covenant signed and notarized 30 years ago, with language so sharp it felt like a trap lying in wait. It was called a development restriction covenant, paired with a right of first refusal. I sat back on the dusty floor, papers trembling in my hands. The words on the page were like gold. Any unauthorized development on the property would automatically revert ownership to the family trust, unless a specific consent waiver was filed with the county clerk beforehand. And Victoria, she had bulldozed my cabin, poured millions into her villa, and in her arrogance never filed that waiver. I laughed, actually laughed, sitting there surrounded by dust and boxes because it was so simple, so brilliant. My grandfather hadn't been paranoid, he'd been prophetic. Victoria's $3.5 million villa wasn't just illegal. It was about to become mine the second she finished it. Every marble countertop, every chandelier, every smart home system wired into her little revenge fantasy. Legally mine, thanks to Grandpa's foresight. But I couldn't tell anyone. Not Danny, not my parents, not even the neighbors who pitied me so much they brought casseroles to my door like I was grieving a death. If even one word slipped out, if Victoria caught wind of the covenant before the project was finished, she'd stall, delay, cover her tracks. So I had to keep playing the role. The fool who'd given up. The broken man who nodded politely at the woman stealing his land. And that performance was tearing my family apart. The very next morning, Danny staged what he called an intervention. He packed our parents, 2 aunts, and even a cousin into Mom and Dad's living room, all of them staring at me like I was possessed. Danny paced like a preacher at a revival. "He's lost it," he told them, pointing at me. "Grandpa died protecting that land, and Jake's just handing it over like it doesn't matter. He's thanking them. He's praising them. It's like he's under some kind of spell." My father, who'd never raised his voice at me in 38 years, stood up and said words that cut deeper than any betrayal. "Son, I don't know what's happened to you, but this isn't the way your grandfather would have wanted it." I swallowed the lump in my throat. I wanted to shout, to slam the covenant on the table, to prove them all wrong. But one wrong word, one accidental leak, could ruin everything. So I sat there, quiet, nodding, letting them believe I was broken. It hurt worse than watching the cabin crumble. Later that week, at a community meeting Victoria hosted, I showed up, sat in the back, and listened as she unveiled glossy renderings of her Lakeside masterpiece. She had catered snacks, bottled water, even little gift bags for neighbors who came to hear about her investment in the community. When she asked if anyone had thoughts, my hand went up first. "I think this is exactly what our neighborhood needs," I said loud enough for everyone to hear. "In fact, I'd love to see some premium upgrades. Imported marble, maybe, an infinity pool by the lake, definitely one of those smart systems that controls everything from your phone." You could have heard a pin drop. The woman who had destroyed my cabin forced a smile so tight it looked painful, and the room filled with the kind of silence that only happens when everyone thinks they're watching a man completely lose his mind. Good, that was exactly what I needed them to think. Because every day that villa rose higher into the sky, every day Victoria poured money into imported stone and luxury appliances, was another day she unknowingly built my house. And I wasn't just watching, I was documenting, quietly, carefully. Night after night, I walked the property line with my notebook and camera, capturing photos of her septic shortcuts, illegal runoff into the lake, violations that could shut the project down instantly if I reported them. But I didn't, not yet, because the best catches come when you let the fish take the bait all the way. And Victoria, she was swallowing the hook hole. It's funny how betrayal doesn't always crash through your door. Sometimes it tiptoes in with a smile and a thermos of coffee. Lisa had always been that kind of neighbor, the one who left soup on your porch when you were sick, who watered your plants when you went out of town, who waved with a warmth that made you feel like you weren't alone. After the demolition, she showed up like clockwork, always wearing that same concerned expression. "This must be devastating for you, Jake," she whispered once, her hand brushing my arm. "Do you have a plan, any savings, a lawyer you can call?" At first, I thought it was kindness, but the questions kept coming. Too specific, too sharp, not the kind of things you ask out of sympathy. She wanted to know if I had backup financial reserves, whether I had any hidden assets, whether the family had a safety net. It felt less like comfort and more like an interview, like she was filling out a report. The odd thing was I didn't let it bother me, because by then I was already used to people underestimating me. My brother thought I was broken. My parents thought I was dishonoring Grandpa's memory. The neighbors whispered like I'd lost touch with reality. Why not let Lisa join the chorus? But somewhere inside I filed it away. Every question, every visit. And while she pressed for answers, I kept pressing the shutter on my camera. Each night, I documented more of Victoria's shortcuts, septic systems thrown together in days instead of weeks, contaminated runoff streaking down into the lake, wiring done by men who barely looked qualified to hang a ceiling fan. The photos piled up, quiet as footprints in the snow. By week 2, Victoria's lawyer sent me a cease and desist letter. I opened the envelope in my kitchen, read the stiff legal language threatening me with future consequences, and laughed out loud. The sound startled even me. Right on schedule. The performance was working. She thought I was a fool. She thought she'd broken me down so completely I wasn't even worth the fight. And Lisa, she reinforced that image. She'd stop by, always with something in her hands, banana bread, leftovers, coffee. But the questions had sharpened like knives. "Did your grandfather leave any legal protections?" she asked once almost casually. "I mean, he seemed like the type to keep documents." Her eyes flicked to my notebook on the counter. I shrugged, masking the shiver that ran through me. "Grandpa kept records of everything," I said, letting the words hang in the air like a joke. "We used to call it his paranoid paperwork. He filed documents like a squirrel hides nuts." For just a split second I saw it, a flicker across her face. Relief or recognition. Victoria wasn't the only one watching me closely. The strangest thing was how everyone else began to pity me. Neighbors crossed the street when I walked by, their conversations halting like I carried a disease. Parents whispered to their kids when I lingered near the dock. Even Danny stopped returning my calls, convinced I'd surrendered to insanity. Isolation has a sound. It's the quiet creak of your front gate when no one visits anymore. The hollow thud of your boots on the porch when no one's walking beside you. But I kept smiling, I kept documenting, and one night that patience paid off. I was coming back from a grocery run earlier than usual. The house was dark, but as I turned the corner by my back door, I heard it, a low voice, hushed but sharp. I froze. Through the kitchen window, I saw her, Lisa, standing with her phone pressed to her ear, facing away from me. "He's not planning any legal action," she whispered. "Looks completely defeated. Victoria can proceed without worry. He's either broken or he's given up." I stood there, fingers tightening around the grocery bag, milk sweating down the side of the carton. My neighbor, my friend, reporting on me like I was some target in a war. When I opened the door, she flinched, fumbling to hang up. The guilty look said everything her mouth didn't. "Neighborhood concerns," she stammered, eyes darting. "Just chatting with someone about what's happening." We both knew it was a lie. "How long, Lisa?" I asked quietly, setting the bag on the counter. "How long have you been telling her about me?" Her lips trembled. She looked anywhere but my eyes. Words stumbled out: community, safety, stress, concern, none of it landing. And in that silence, in the way her hands shook and her eyes glistened, I realized something that chilled me more than the betrayal itself. I wasn't surprised. Every strange question, every visit timed just when I was alone, every probing look at my notebook, part of me had been expecting this. I didn't raise my voice, didn't throw her out. I just nodded thoughtful as if she'd confessed something mundane, like the weather forecast. Her confusion was almost painful to watch. People expect anger, they brace for it. But calm unsettles them in ways rage never can. Later that week, Victoria stood at another community meeting, her voice smooth as ever, and dropped a line that cut me to the bone. "We're all worried about Jake," she said, eyes sweeping the room. "Losing the cabin, the financial struggles, the stress, it's taken a toll. His family's even expressed concerns about his emotional stability." Details of my mortgage, my savings, my family conversations. Things she couldn't have known without a source. And Lisa sat there in the crowd, hands clasped tightly in her lap, unable to meet my eyes. Betrayal doesn't always announce itself with knives or fire. Sometimes it arrives in the face you trusted most, smiling while it cuts. But I didn't falter, not yet, because even betrayal has its use. And every question Lisa asked, every word she carried back to Victoria was part of the larger net I was weaving. Because when the hook finally set, they wouldn't just be caught, they'd be exposed. Have you ever noticed how silence in a neighborhood changes when something's wrong? The birds stop nesting near the water. The kids stop laughing on the docks. Conversations get shorter, quieter. That's how it started, not with sirens or warnings, but with silence. The lake I grew up on was never quiet. Frogs at dusk, loons calling across the water, the hum of kids splashing until their parents called them in. But a few weeks into Victoria's construction, the water had turned a sick brown. Fish floated belly up near the shoreline, and the smell, metallic, sour, lingered in the air. Neighbors whispered that maybe it was seasonal algae, some natural bloom, but I knew. I'd seen the shortcuts. The septic system thrown together like an afterthought, pipes barely sealed, runoff pouring down the slope into the lake. Every corner cut to shave days off the schedule was seeping into the water that had sustained our families for generations. I walked the property lines every night, flashlight in one hand, notebook in the other. The gravel crunched under my boots, the gate creaked behind me, and the construction crew sometimes waved, thinking I was just some obsessed fool who couldn't let go. They didn't realize every photo I took of muddy trenches bleeding into the lake, of chemical barrels stashed carelessly near the shore, was another nail in Victoria's coffin. But I didn't report a thing, not yet, because timing was everything. Neighbors began noticing. A boy got sick after swimming. A couple of kids complained of stomach aches after drinking from their family wells. Tap water came out cloudy in a few homes. The doctor in town started asking questions. Victoria brushed it off at meetings with that smile that was cracking more each day. Seasonal fluctuations, old pipes, perfectly normal. But her eyes, those betrayed her. She was afraid. My brother showed up one evening, standing on my porch like he wasn't sure if he should hug me or have me committed. "Jake, people are saying you've lost touch with reality. You're out there every night with a notebook like some conspiracy nut. They think you need help." I looked at him, and the words that came out surprised even me. Sometimes the best way to win is to look like you've already lost. He shook his head, the disappointment sharp in his eyes. "I don't know who you are anymore." And when he walked away, I felt the ache of it. Losing my brother hurt worse than losing the cabin. But I couldn't break character, not yet. Meanwhile, Lisa, her guilt was showing. She still came around, but the questions were half-hearted now. Her eyes wouldn't meet mine. When neighbors praised her for being such a good friend during my rough time, she'd excuse herself, face flushed. I treated her the same as always. Calm, polite, never angry. And that seemed to disturb her more than any explosion would have. Because if I wasn't angry, maybe it meant I'd expected her betrayal all along. One night, while I was taking photos by the lake, I saw it, a stream of gray sludge leaking straight into the water from behind a half-buried pipe. I crouched down, camera steady, the smell burning my nostrils, and snapped photo after photo. The next morning, parents were in the doctor's office with kids doubled over in pain. The emergency room logged a cluster of strange gastrointestinal cases. And still, Victoria pressed forward, barking at crews to work double shifts, cutting even more corners in her desperation to finish. That's when the county health inspector showed up, unannounced, clipboard in hand. I watched from my window as Victoria practically sprinted across the site, her face pale, barking orders, her polished mask slipping into panic. Later that day, she cornered me in my driveway. No neighbors around, no smile, just venom. "Keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you," she hissed. I didn't flinch, just tilted my head, almost amused. "Or what? You'll steal my property." For the first time since this began, she stepped back, because there was something in my voice she couldn't place. Confidence. She thought I was broken, but that tone told her I wasn't broken at all. And maybe, just maybe, I'd been the one waiting for her to break. That night, as I filed away another set of photos, I remembered something Grandpa used to tell me on the dock. The biggest fish don't fight right away. They circle, test the line, wait. You only set the hook once they've swallowed the bait. Victoria was circling, growing frantic, cutting corners until her villa was built on poison and lies, and with every desperate move she made, the bait went deeper. Soon enough, the line would snap tight. Have you ever had someone finally drop the mask they've been wearing, and for the first time, you see the real face staring back at you? That's what happened in my driveway one afternoon, with the noise of hammers and saws thundering in the background. Victoria had always been polished, rehearsed, the queen of community meetings and fake smiles. But that day, under the weight of deadlines and health inspectors breathing down her neck, she snapped. "You want to know why this is happening to you specifically, Jake?" She spat, eyes sharp as broken glass. Her voice trembled with rage, and then she said the words that made the whole twisted puzzle fall into place. "2 years ago, your precious girlfriend Sarah left my husband for you. Right after our divorce, she chose you over him. That humiliation ruined him, and now, I'm ruining you." It hit me like a gut punch. This wasn't just business. This wasn't just some investment group playing games with property. This was revenge. A $3.5 million vendetta, wrapped in construction permits and luxury amenities. I stood there listening to her fury spill out, and something in me went cold. Because it meant every move she'd made, every permit, every whisper to the neighbors, every forced smile hadn't just been about money. It was personal. She turned my entire life into a revenge project. And it explained Lisa. The truth about my neighbor came out in tears a few nights later. We were sitting in my kitchen, the air heavy between us, when she broke down. "I never wanted to spy on you," she whispered, voice cracking. "I had no choice." Turns out Victoria controlled a tax lien network through her investors. Lisa's late husband had left behind a $50,000 property tax debt, one she could barely manage while raising 2 kids alone. Victoria bought that debt from the county at a discount and used it like a leash. "She told me if I didn't cooperate," Lisa said, choking back sobs, "she'd accelerate collection. I'd lose my house, everything. I couldn't risk it, Jake, I couldn't." Every time Lisa showed up at my door with coffee, every sympathetic question, every soft smile, it hadn't been kindness. It had been survival. She was feeding Victoria information about my finances, my family, even my supposed breakdown. I sat there, nodding slowly, and Lisa's tears fell harder because she couldn't understand why I wasn't screaming, why I wasn't raging about betrayal. But what could rage do that patience hadn't already set in motion? Still, the scale of it shook me. This wasn't just Victoria. She wasn't the mastermind. She was a pawn, too, a desperate middle manager for an investment group that had perfected the art of targeting vulnerable families. Lisa explained how it worked. They bought up tax debts quietly, waited until families were at their weakest, divorce, illness, job loss, then pounced. Victoria's job was to localize the attack, gather intelligence, and apply pressure until people sold or lost everything. And me, I was just the unlucky target caught in the crosshairs of her personal grudge. But the cracks were forming. The lake contamination was worsening, kids were sick, and even Victoria's supporters were starting to whisper. At community meetings, her voice had lost its charm, her smile was brittle, her explanations shallow. Meanwhile, I kept walking the property line, kept taking photos of every violation, pipes leaking, septic systems bubbling up into the soil, luxury pools filled with contaminated lake water. Every detail was another bead on the necklace I was stringing around her neck. Then came the night she crossed a line. I'd just returned from one of my midnight documentation walks, boots caked in mud, when I heard footsteps on my porch. Victoria herself, no smile, no pretense, just fury. "You think you're clever," she hissed. "But I know what you're doing. Keep playing your little game, Jake. It won't matter when you're homeless and bankrupt." I stepped closer, close enough to see the sweat at her hairline. "Funny thing about games," I said quietly. "Sometimes the player you think is losing is the one setting the rules." Her breath hitched. For the first time, she looked uncertain. And I walked back inside without another word, leaving her standing there in the dark. The truth was, I'd been waiting for this, for her to get desperate enough to reveal her hand, because desperation makes mistakes, and every mistake was another thread tightening in Grandpa's trap. Lisa's betrayal had stung, yes, but her confession gave me something even more valuable than trust information. Proof that Victoria and her investors weren't just greedy, they were predators. The community thought I was broken. My family thought I'd lost my mind. Victoria thought she was winning. But in reality, every insult, every betrayal, every poisoned gallon of lake water was evidence. Evidence I was quietly stacking, waiting for the day I'd open the floodgates and let it drown them all. And that day was getting closer. The first time I sat down with Tom, I didn't even bring the covenant. I just brought coffee. It was late afternoon, the office quiet except for the hum of an old fan, and he looked at me like I was wasting his time. "Jake, I can't fight feelings," he sighed, pushing his glasses up. "If you want to sue her for emotional distress, you'll spend 10 years in court and go broke before you win a dime." I let the silence hang, then I slid the covenant across his desk. His eyes skimmed it once, twice. By the third pass, his face had drained of color. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. "My grandfather," I said. "He filed it 30 years ago. She bulldozed the cabin without filing the waiver." Tom leaned back in his chair, the paper trembling in his hands. "Jake, do you understand what this means? If she finishes that villa, it's yours, not hers, yours." I nodded once, calm, quiet, the way I'd trained myself to be. Tom rubbed his temples, then shook his head, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Holy hell, you've been playing the long game." I didn't correct him. I didn't tell him about the sleepless nights, the pit in my stomach, the way my family thought I'd lost my mind. Some truths are heavier if you try to explain them. Instead, I pulled out my notebook. Photos of septic leaks, construction shortcuts, runoff into the lake. Evidence, quietly gathered, carefully logged. Tom flipped through it, muttering under his breath. "Environmental violations, covenant breach, financial fraud. Jake, this isn't just one case. This is a bomb, and if we time it right, we don't just win, we end her." That was the first time I let myself smile. But timing was everything. We couldn't strike too soon, not while Victoria still had room to maneuver, not while her investors still believed in her. Meanwhile, the lake was dying. The water near the shore turned a murky green. Fish floated in clusters. Families stopped letting their kids swim. People started hauling bottled water into town because their wells tasted like metal. At the grocery store, two mothers argued over who was responsible for their kids' stomach illnesses. At the gas station, a man cursed Victoria's name loud enough for everyone to hear. The whispers were turning into anger. And Victoria knew it. She doubled down. Crews worked day and night, lights blazing across the site until midnight. Trucks barreled down the narrow streets, rattling windows. The noise, the dust, the smell, it was eating away at the neighborhood's patience. But she was trapped. She couldn't slow down, couldn't pause to fix her mistakes. If she delayed, investors would start asking questions. If she admitted to contamination, inspectors would shut her down. The only way out was forward, faster, louder, riskier. And every corner she cut was another gift to me. One evening, I spotted Lisa standing by her mailbox, arms wrapped around herself, eyes on the lake. For the first time, she didn't look like a spy or a traitor. She looked like a mother terrified for her children. When I approached, she whispered, "My youngest has been sick for 2 days. Fever, cramps, nausea. Doctor says it's from the water." Her voice cracked. "Jake, what have we done?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because the truth was, her guilt wasn't hers alone. It belonged to Victoria, to the investors, to every smiling predator who thought profit was worth poisoning a community. And soon, I'd make sure everyone saw it. Tom and I met in secret, often after dark. I'd bring him new photos, new reports, new whispers from neighbors. He started pulling public records, property liens, investor contracts, shell companies traced back to one office in the city. It was bigger than I thought. The group Victoria worked for had done this before, dozens of times. Small towns, lakefront properties, rural families with more memories than money. They'd swoop in, buy up debts, apply pressure until people cracked, then flip the land into luxury projects. Predators dressed in suits. "Jake," Tom said one night, his voice low, "if we expose this, it won't just be about your cabin. We could take down the whole network." But I shook my head. One battle at a time, first we finish her. The waiting was torture. Watching neighbors suffer while I kept the evidence tucked away felt like betrayal all over again. But if I moved too soon, the trap wouldn't spring shut. So I stayed silent. Neighbors crossed the street when they saw me, whispering that I was unhinged, obsessed. My parents barely called anymore. Danny wouldn't look me in the eye. And every night I sat alone with my files, my camera, my grandfather's covenant. The loneliness was crushing, but I kept reminding myself silence is where victory grows. One night, standing by the lake, the smell of rot heavy in the air, I whispered aloud to the water, as if Grandpa was still out there in his fishing chair. "Almost time." The night it all started to unravel wasn't stormy or dramatic. It was quiet, too quiet. I was on the porch, boots on the railing, when the first shouting started down the street. A mother's voice, shrill with panic. Then another. Within minutes, half a dozen neighbors were standing near the lake, flashlights flickering across the water, voices rising in fear. Another child had fallen sick. This time, so badly they had to call an ambulance. Red and blue lights painted the trees as paramedics loaded the boy onto a stretcher. His father's face was white with fury. And for the first time, no one looked at me like I was crazy. They looked at Victoria's half-finished villa towering over the shoreline like a monument to poison. The silence was gone. The neighborhood was awake. The next morning, inspectors returned, this time with clipboards, cameras, and water testing kits. They didn't just walk the site. They marched through it. I stood at the edge of the crowd of neighbors, listening as one of them muttered into a recorder, "Possible groundwater contamination, evidence of septic failure, pending violations." Victoria tried to charm them, of course. She wore her brightest dress, offered coffee, smiled until her lips trembled. But her words fell flat against the sour stench of the lake and the angry murmurs of parents holding sick children. The Queen's mask had slipped, and the crowd saw it. That evening, the community meeting turned into a riot. People didn't sit politely in rows. They stood, arms crossed, voices raised, demanding answers. "You said it was seasonal," one man roared. "My daughter been sick for 2 weeks," a woman cried, tears streaking her face. Victoria stood at the front, trying to calm the storm, but every word she spoke only fanned the flames. I sat in the back, quiet, letting the noise wash over me. Then, when the shouting reached its peak, I stood. The room fell still. For the first time in months, every eye was on me, not with pity, not with mockery, but with desperate expectation. And I gave them nothing. No accusations, no speeches, just a calm, steady voice. The truth always comes out, wait. I sat back down. The whispers rippled through the crowd like wind across the lake, and I could see it in Victoria's eyes, panic. Because silence is louder than shouting when it comes at the right time. That night she came to my porch again. No entourage, no smile, just desperation. "What do you want, Jake?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "Money, a payoff, name your number." I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Finish it." Her brow furrowed. "What?" "Finish your villa," I repeated. "Put in the marble, hang the chandeliers, build the dock, don't stop now." She stared at me like I was insane. And maybe I was. But she couldn't see the covenant sitting in Tom's safe, couldn't hear the inspectors, mutterings already piling into reports, couldn't feel the tide of the neighborhood turning against her. She just saw a man who looked beaten, daring her to keep walking into his trap. And she couldn't resist. Within a week, crews were back to double shifts. Concrete trucks rumbled down the road before dawn. Workers hammered and sawed until midnight. Every corner cut, every safety protocol ignored, every shortcut documented. Lisa stopped by one afternoon, eyes red from crying. "She knows something's wrong," she whispered. "She's lashing out at everyone. Investors are breathing down her neck. She's terrified you're planning something." I poured her coffee, set it in front of her, and simply said, "Good." Because fear makes people sloppy. The inspectors returned again, this time with county officials. They took samples, asked questions, scribbled notes while neighbors followed like angry shadows. And still, I held back. Not yet. Because the hook hadn't set all the way. And then, the moment I'd been waiting for. A glossy invitation arrived in my mailbox. Victoria's handwriting across the envelope, elegant and furious at the same time. "You are cordially invited to the unveiling of Sterling Villa." She was going to show it off. Open her poisoned palace to the very people she'd lied to, paraded like a trophy to prove she'd won. I stood in my kitchen, invitation in hand, and for the first time since the demolition, I laughed. Really laughed. Because what she thought would be her triumph would be her undoing. The villa wasn't hers, it never was. And at the unveiling, in front of neighbors, investors, and county officials, I would finally spring the trap my grandfather had left for me. Almost time. The day of the unveiling dawned clear, sharp, and cruelly beautiful. The kind of morning where the lake looked like glass, reflecting every mistake back at the people who made it. I arrived in my old truck, dust kicking up behind me, boots crunching on the gravel. Neighbors gathered in clusters, some curious, some angry, most just tired of the chaos that had consumed their lives for months. Victoria stood at the front steps of the gleaming villa, her smile stretched tight, her dress immaculate. From a distance, she looked like a queen presenting her castle. But up close, I could see it, the faint tremor in her hands, the tension in her jaw. She was unraveling, and she knew it. Inside, the villa was obscene. Marble floors polished to a mirror shine. Crystal chandeliers dripping light like rain. Walls painted with imported finishes that smelled faintly of chemicals. Investors murmured approvingly, their suits sharp, their pens ready to sign contracts. Victoria clinked a glass, her voice ringing out. "Neighbors, friends, partners, welcome to the future of our community." Applause rippled weakly. Some clapped out of obligation, others out of habit. No one clapped out of joy. I stayed at the back, hands in my pockets, silent, waiting. When the inspectors stepped forward, clipboards in hand, the room quieted. They spoke about pending investigations, about environmental concerns, about unresolved compliance issues. Victoria waved it all away, laughing too loudly, insisting everything was under control. That was my moment. I walked to the center of the room, every eye following. My boots echoed against the marble, dust from the driveway trailing behind me like a shadow. "Funny thing about control," I said softly, my voice carrying in the silence. "It slips through your fingers the tighter you grip it." Victoria's smile faltered. "Jake, this isn't the time." "Oh, it's exactly the time," I interrupted. I pulled a folder from my jacket and laid it on the polished countertop, the covenant crisp against the marble. "This," I said, tapping the paper, is a development restriction covenant signed by my grandfather and filed 30 years ago. It states that any unauthorized construction on this land reverts ownership back to the family trust. No waiver was filed, which means, Victoria. I paused, letting the silence stretch. This villa isn't yours, it's mine. Gasps rippled through the room. Neighbors leaned in, investors stiffened, inspectors scribbled furiously. Victoria's face drained of color. She lunged forward, snatching at the paper, but Tom stepped out from the crowd, his voice firm. It's already been certified by the county clerk, legally binding, enforceable, immediate. The weight of it landed like thunder. Investors began muttering angrily, some storming toward the door. One man snapped, "You told us this property was clean, you lied." Another hissed, "We're finished here." Victoria spun, desperate, her perfect image shattering. "No, this is mine, I built this." But the words rang hollow, bouncing off walls she no longer owned. Neighbors stared, some with shock, some with satisfaction. Danny, who had slipped quietly into the back, met my eyes for the first time in months, and this time there was no disappointment, just awe. Lisa stood near the door, tears streaking her face, her hands clasped tight. She looked at me like she wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Victoria collapsed onto one of her imported sofas, head in her hands, the reality settling in. She'd spent millions, ruined the lake, poisoned the neighborhood, and in the end, she'd built me a palace I never asked for. I didn't gloat, didn't raise my voice. I just turned to the inspectors and said, "Now about those environmental violations." The room erupted, cameras flashed, voices rose. But I walked out into the sunlight, the air cleaner than it had felt in months, the weight of silence lifting from my shoulders. Neighbors followed, some clapping me on the back, some apologizing for doubting me. My brother stood stiffly for a moment, then pulled me into a hug so tight it almost broke me. "You knew all along," he whispered. I nodded. Grandpa set the trap. I just waited for the fish to swallow the hook. The lake would take years to heal. Families would carry the scars of betrayal and sickness. But in that moment, as the sun sparkled across the water, I felt something I hadn't in months. Peace. Later, sitting on the dock where the cabin once stood, I let the silence wash over me. No hammers, no trucks, just the creak of the boards, the ripple of the lake, the whisper of memory. Grandpa's voice echoed in my head. Dignity doesn't always look like pride. Sometimes it looks like patience. And for the first time, I understood. Victoria had tried to destroy me. She poisoned the water, bought my neighbors, turned my family against me. But in the end, she destroyed herself. Because greed always does. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.